Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. And today I want to talk a bit about Austria following the Anschluss of 1938. Now, normally, the way this tends to get taught in schools is you look at Hitler's foreign policy from 1936 onwards and the remilitarization of the Rhineland and the Anschluss and then the Sudeten crisis and then really the invasion of the rest of the Czech part of Czechoslovakia in 1939 and Poland in September that year and World War II breaking out. And Austria features up until the Anschluss happens, and thereafter the kind of the story tends to get lost. Well, this is just the nature of exam boards and syllabuses for you. They have to draw the line somewhere. But there is a powerful and complex story to be told all the way up to the occupation of Austria at the end of the Second World War. So the actual annexation of Austria happens on the 12th of March 1938. Hitler had tried it previously in 1934, but he had been forced to stand down when Mussolini, with a much larger force, threatened to march through the Brenner Pass into Austria in order to prevent Hitler. This was before the real deepening of the relationship between the two dictators, and on their first meeting they had nothing but kind of contemptuous statements to make about one another. The destruction of the Austrian state is detailed in great depth in Timothy Snyder's brilliant book Black Earth, and he actually refers to Hitler as a racial anarchist. Not that he was suggesting that Hitler was in any way sympathetic to the ideas of like Bakunin or Fourier or Proudhon or anyone like that. Certainly not. But what he suggests by calling him a racial anarchist is that Hitler only saw the state as having any value as long as it was serving racial needs. When the state itself is an impediment to the advancement of Hitler's racial ideology, and Hitler's racial thinking really is the bedrock of all his ideas and beliefs, then the state must be simply dissolved, annihilated. And in the case of Austria, that's what happens. Austria as a nation-state ceases to exist, is incorporated into the Reich, and the legal protections that are given to citizens, and particularly to Jewish citizens, therefore go. The Jews very overnight go from being citizens of Austria to being stateless people within a larger German empire. Anyway, the book that I'm working from today is Giles MacDonough's really superb read, After the Reich, Austria and Germany and Austria, from the fall of Vienna to the Berlin Airlift. So as previously mentioned, the anti-Semitic regime that is brought into Austria is actually far more extreme in early 1938 than anything seen in Germany later on that year. In November 1938, there is the pogrom, Kristallnacht, that occurs. Now, again, the way in which Timothy Snyder has looked at this is he suggested that the disparity can be explained thusly, that really Austria was a kind of like a testing ground for anti-Semitic violence and for a kind of a laboratory for hate. And then whence it was shown how that this could be effective, that certain key policy goals could be achieved in this manner, and that the population could be taken in particular directions through the medium of mass humiliation of the Jews. Then there was going to be these things were going to be taken from pilot schemes in Austria and implemented throughout the Reich. There was some attempt at the end of the Second World War to portray Austria really as the innocent victim of Nazism, that Austrians by and large hadn't wanted to be annexed, and they hadn't chosen really to be part of Hitler's war, and they were the kind of the hostages to Nazism. Now the reality is something quite different. Now, trying to gauge social attitudes, even at in the present moment, trying to gauge social attitudes in 2017 is difficult enough. Trying to gauge social attitudes in 1938 or 1945 is extremely challenging. So we can only make our best guesses. The vote to dissolve Austria and combine in the Anschluss with Germany is one which is so overwhelmingly won that one has to obviously cast doubt over the outcome. By and large, when people are elected with a mandate of 88 or 80 or 90%, the stuffed ballot boxes are always going to be involved. And I think it's been long proven that the entire referendum was rigged. But how much it needed to be rigged is a different question. There seems to have been some groundswell of support for a union with Germany, and it had only been in 1866 when Austria, the Austrian Empire, soon to become the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as it were, was comprehensively forced out of the German Confederation, and so forced out of the process of building a greater Germany. So really, this would have been with grandparents at the time of, or elderly people at the time of 1938, within living memory. Following the Anschluss, it wasn't simply Jews that were persecuted. There were trainloads of political prisoners, the Prominenten, as they were referred to, who were shipped to Dachau. These were members of the government of the ex-Chancellor Dollfuss, who 4 years earlier had put down a Nazi coup d'etat, and the revenge of the Nazis was exemplified in the book Men Crucified by Bruno Heilig. Ministers, civil servants and magistrates who were elderly men were sent for hard labour and physically broken or beaten to death. Some went to Dachau, others went to Buchenwald or the newer camp at Mauthausen, infamous for its stone steps on which inmates had to carry up slabs of granite in a relentless march of death. A tenth of the population joined the Nazis, tenth of the adult population anyway. And there might have been the possibility of far more had the Nazis not played their hand with atypical crassness, viewing Austria as merely a place for asset stripping, as something that could now be plundered to enrich the rest of the Reich. And the evidence of this you can find in Goering's 4-year plan, when Goering became the Reich plenipotentiary in charge of the economy and building it up ready for war. Industry was appropriated by the office, and German officials and planners and bureaucrats and technocrats took long and very luxurious often visits to Austria and saw themselves swanning around these kind of newly acquired territory. Austrians themselves were treated as sort of junior partners in this new wonderful enterprise, and now they were going to have the senior partner, Germany, administering their country. This is something that has stuck in the throat of many Austrians ever since. Following the outbreak of war in 1939, Austria was treated, as you would imagine, by Britain, France, and then later America as a continuation of the Reich, despite the fact that Austrian exiles often tried to plead a special case for their homeland, saying that this certainly wasn't the case. Allied leaders had very little sympathy for these emigres and for their argument. And there was little desire initially to treat Austria as the unintended victim, but that narrative actually does emerge later on. No one thought that Austria should have a government in exile, much in the same way that the Poles or the Czechs or the Norwegians or the Free French had a government in exile. There was no distinction between Germany and Austria in the eyes of their enemies. There were a number of solutions proposed during the Second World War as to what to do about Austria. The first was to restore it to its status in 1938, leaving it the independent state that it had been. The second was to actually leave Germany and Austria fused together. The third was making a kind of confederation of the Danube, a sort of version of the German Confederation that had existed up until 1871, but based around what had previously been the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That had all sorts of complications because obviously it would have involved Czechoslovakia, and it would have involved Hungary, and perhaps other nations in Eastern Europe which were within the Soviet sphere of influence, and some kind of small union of trading nations there would not have suited the interests of Stalin. A fourth option was it was going to be a kind of a continuation of Henry Morgenthau's plan, which was to leave Germany, this kind of pastoral, deindustrialized country. And this could perhaps happen to Austria too. There would be a separation of Austria's provinces, with some of the provinces going to Switzerland and the Tyrol and Salzburg going to Bavaria, when Bavaria would then be made a separate state, as it had been prior to the creation of the German Empire. It had been its own kingdom within the Holy Roman Empire and the German Confederation, with a kind of a fearsomely independent streak when it was within Germany. The fifth option was to put Austria and Bavaria together to create a southern Catholic German state and leave a northern Protestant German state. This all was mooted really on the side of the Western Allies. Generally these kinds of things were discussed before the realities of Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe really sunk in, and the idea that one could start to create Catholic and Protestant German states instead of capitalist and communist ones seems naive and fanciful to us now. Having Austria in a pliant and weak position where it had to struggle extremely hard to prove its worth and to prove that it was a redeemed state, was useful to the Allies in 1945. The reality is that between the beginning and the end of that year, the fear of permanent Soviet occupation was the guiding principle in Austrian diplomacy with the Western Allies, and the idea that Austria might have to work very hard to become part of Western Europe, and things could really go quite badly wrong for Austria, was a key negotiating tool or leverage from the Western perspective. In 1943, the Allies issued the Moscow Declaration in October, which stated that Austria, which was the first victim of Nazi aggression, must be liberated from German domination. That sounds good, doesn't it? However, it goes on to read, Austria is nonetheless reminded that it bears a responsibility from which it may not escape, for for having participated in the war on the side of Hitler's Germany, and that in the final reckoning the role that it plays in its own liberation will inevitably be taken into account. A subtle hint for the Austrians to behave as the Poles did the following year in 1944 and rise up against the Nazis. Not only was there not the equivalent of the Polish Home Army in Austria, but also when the Poles did rise up against the Nazis, the Russians sat back and let the SS slaughter them and raze Warsaw to the ground. Stalin obviously had a powerful influencing role on the Moscow Declaration, which meant that there would be no Danubian Federation, there would be no return of the Habsburg family to the throne, and there would be the distinct possibility from Roosevelt's perspective of pursuing the Morgenthau Plan. Roosevelt seems to, towards the end of the war, have been profoundly Germanophobic, and has seen really the Germans as a source of trouble in the world, and a scourge to be punished, and kind of a cat to be declawed forever. However, the Morgenthau Plan doesn't happen. It is seen as being sort of wildly unworkable, and something that will inevitably lead to further conflict in Europe. In October 1944, the Soviets demanded an acceleration in the planning of an Austrian solution, and they saw it as a way of quickly drawing advantageous front lines in the Cold War. They wanted basically to iron out which zones of occupation in Austria would be theirs. The French seem to have had little interest in Austria, though they do begin to demand reparations later on when they find dismantled bits of French industrial hardware stolen during the fall of France in Austria, and rightly accuse Austria of having benefited from the looting of France. The Russians demanded Burgenland and the eastern part of Lower Austria, and they wanted to keep together the eastern half of Styria with Graz, and this was where the main industries were located, which had been taken out of Germany to put them a safe distance away from Allied bombers. The British thought that they would have the western half of Austria and Carinthia, and the Americans could take whatever was left. Vienna itself was divided into zones between the British and the Americans and the Russians, and there was a plan even to control traffic along the River Danube by the Russians. Exiles obviously wanted to have a key role in shaping the future of Austria. There were 30,000 of them in Britain, but the vast majority of these were Jews who had fled in 1938. Some had been evacuated in Sir Nicholas Winton's Kindertransport programme, but there were many adults as well. There was an Austrian centre on Westbourne Terrace in Paddington, and it had its own restaurant, library and reading room, and its own newspaper. So there was a kind of a well-organised émigré community in London, and a Jewish émigré community for the most part. And it was only, obviously, towards the end of the war that the full extent of the Holocaust was known and understood. There was, and prior to this point, there had been an active campaign amongst the exiles, Jewish and non-Jewish, to return Jews to Austria. The realisation of the Holocaust seems to obviously have dramatically changed this. As early as 1939, exiles in London were talking about a new Austria. In June that year, there was a discussion group called Das Kommende Österreich, or the Coming Austria, which took in recommendations not just from the exiles in Britain, but also exiles who had gone to Moscow. These were obviously communist Austrians. 1944, one of the key figures in the Moscow group, Ernst Fischer, published a book called The Rebirth of My Country, in which he advocated the total divorce of Austria from Germany and the reorientation of Austria with countries like Yugoslavia and or Czechoslovakia. So within the emigre communities, there were competing visions for what Austria should be. A liberal democracy, as dreamt up by the London Austrians, or a Soviet state, as seen by the Moscow Austrians. Zionist groups amongst the Jewish Austrian emigres in London sought to capitalise the reservations that many Austrian Jews who'd found refuge in Britain had. Obviously encouraging, after the end of the Second World War, educated and able Austrian Jews to go not back to Austria but to Palestine was a key objective of both moderate and radical Zionists. There was a propaganda campaign from the other end of the initiative, from non-Zionist, non-Jewish Austrian emigres, to encourage Jews eventually to go back to Austria at the end of the war. A slogan, Österreichers Juden genacht Österreich zurück. I probably said that all wrong, but Austrian Jews go back to Austria. And in 1941, there emerged the Free Austrian Movement. The Free Austrian Movement is really a cover for the Austrian communists. It was one of Stalin's many initiatives to create popular front movements, and that would eventually become popular front governments. That would eventually, the political plurality would wither away, and the communists would seize power. The Free Austrian Movement, or the Free Austrian World Movement as it later becomes known as, is something of a non-starter, as social democrats and conservatives and monarchists in exile clock it for what it is, a communist front organisation, and give it short shrift. There were many Austrian social democrats and moderate conservatives who saw Austria as being a non-viable state on its own, and some sort of union with Germany in order for Austria to economically exist was essential. However, this was something that various emigre movements had to balance alongside the knowledge that Austria's affiliation with Germany had meant really an affiliation with Nazism, which had kind of condemned the nation. Communists hoped that a completely divorced country, a country with no further relationship with Germany, could manage to jettison Austria's fascist past, and could then manage to kind of move beyond the guilt of the Holocaust, and could present itself as a kind of a victim of fascism, and perhaps even a fighter against fascism. And there's a kind of a narrative from East Germany to Poland to the rest of the Soviet bloc that the war really was the great anti-fascist war, and that helps to kind of create a unified Soviet narrative, and helps to obviously cover up various inconvenient facts along the way. Winston Churchill, in February 1942, in kind of characteristic bombastic form, said that Austria would be free from the Prussian yoke This was eventually disavowed by the Foreign Office, and because Churchill had essentially committed himself or Britain to an independent Austria as a war aim without really thinking it through. It wasn't decided by 1942 if this was a war aim at all. And later on it becomes something that the Allies do commit themselves to. Now, the fact that the exiles in London were overwhelmingly Jewish, with a smattering of minor royalty in there as well, seems to have activated some latent anti-Semitism in Whitehall. The Foreign Office and the various branches of government and the armed forces dealing with emigres looked upon them as being a bunch of Jews with a spattering of royalty therein, and were unconvinced by them. They didn't see these exiles as being legitimate Austrians at all, and that really speaks volumes about the kind of the hidden anti-Semitic discourses there within not just Britain but the other Allied powers as well. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more, about Austria's experience of, what could euphemistically be called liberation in 1945. Sometime later, perhaps this week, but this is just a kind of little background of the currents of Austrian politics from 1938 to 1945. Hope you enjoyed it, found it useful, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. By the way, swing by our Facebook page, say hi. There's some great conversations there at the moment, some lovely insights, and it's great to hear from you all. Take care, all the best, bye-bye.